London lay beneath a thick, suffocating fog, the kind that blurred the gas lamps into ghostly halos and turned the cobbled streets into a warren of shadows. Whitechapel, already infamous for its spectres of violence, had awakened to yet another horror, one so perplexing that even the hardened inspectors of Scotland Yard were at a loss. And so, as always, when a case defied reason, there was but one name whispered among the constables: Sherlock Holmes. It was Inspector Lestrade himself who had sent for him, the urgency in his telegram betraying the frustration that plagued the Yard. Holmes had received the note with his usual impassivity, save for the faintest glimmer of amusement in his keen grey eyes. And so, at an hour when most of London still slumbered, we found ourselves stepping from a hansom cab onto Buck's Row, a place that had seen more than its share of death. The body lay in the centre of the narrow alleyway, sprawled unnaturally, as though discarded by some unseen hand. A man in his 40s, clean-shaven, well-dressed, not the typical victim of Whitechapel's grim alleys. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood pooling beneath him, and yet his face was contorted into an expression of sheer terror. Lestrade stood a few feet away, arms crossed, exuding the air of a man who had exhausted all logical explanations. "Holmes," he said, the single word carrying both relief and expectation. Holmes did not reply. He crouched beside the corpse, his sharp gaze sweeping over every detail. The victim's hands were frozen in a strange position, fingers slightly curled as though reaching for something or warding something off. His shoes, polished but lightly scuffed, suggested a hurried departure from a more respectable part of town. And then there was the most peculiar clue of all. A single playing card lay on the dead man's chest, placed there with eerie deliberation. The Queen of Spades. "Curious," Holmes murmured, carefully lifting the card by its edges. "A calling card, of sorts. But why this one, I wonder?" Lestrade shook his head. "We found no identification on him. Nothing in his pockets but a few shillings and a monogrammed handkerchief, J.C. Holmes's eyes flickered with recognition. This was not a simple act of murder. There is a message here, though its meaning eludes us for the moment. I stepped closer, examining the scene with a layman's gaze. Could he have died of fright? His expression, I've never seen such terror in a man's face. Possibly, Holmes admitted, rising. But fear alone does not stop the heart, Watson. Something else transpired here. His gaze lingered on the surrounding buildings. The question is, who wanted us to believe this was mere chance? And why? Lestrade cleared his throat. There's more, a witness of sorts. An old woman who claims she saw a figure walking away from the alley shortly before the body was discovered. Said he moved like a shadow, too quick for her to get a good look. Holmes's lips curled slightly. Then let us speak to our witness. Shadows have a habit of vanishing, but footprints, my dear Lestrade, do not. The witness, an elderly woman wrapped in a tattered shawl, stood hunched near the entrance of a dimly lit tenement, her weathered face half hidden in the shadows. Her gnarled hands clutched the edges of her woolen wrap, as if warding off the chill of something more than the London fog. Holmes approached her with measured steps, his sharp gaze dissecting every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. "You saw a man leave the alley," he stated rather than asked. The woman's watery eyes darted toward Lestrade as if seeking reassurance before she gave a slow nod. "Aye, sir. Just past 3 o'clock, I reckon. I don't sleep much these days. I was watching from my window as I do most nights. The fog was thick, but I saw him clear enough." Holmes tilted his head slightly. Describe him. She hesitated, twisting the frayed edge of her shawl between her fingers. Not much to tell, sir. He moved quick, too quick, like he didn't want to be seen. Had a long coat, dark like the night itself. Hat pulled low, but it was the way he walked. Her voice trailed off, her brow furrowing as if struggling to put the sensation into words. Holmes's gaze sharpened. The way he walked. She wet her lips. Not like a man. Sir, more like a shadow gliding smooth across the stones. But his steps, oh, they made no sound. Holmes said nothing at first, only watching her with an intensity that made even Lestrade shift uncomfortably. Then, with a quiet hum, he turned on his heel and strode back toward the body. I followed, exchanging a glance with the inspector, who merely sighed and muttered something about Holmes and his peculiar ways. Holmes crouched beside the corpse once more, but this time his focus shifted. His fingers ghosted over the damp cobblestones, his keen eyes tracing something invisible to the rest of us. After a long moment, he stood abruptly and dusted off his gloves. Curious, he murmured. Very curious indeed. Lestrade frowned. What is? Holmes pointed toward the ground. No footprints. The inspector let out a scoff. It's Whitechapel, Holmes. The stones are slick and the fog distorts everything. Perhaps the prints were simply washed away. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A convenient explanation, but an inadequate one. You see, Lestrade, the victim collapsed here, precisely where he was found. His shoes scuffed the stones as he fell, and yet there is not a single corresponding disturbance leading away from the body. If our fleeing suspect had walked away, there would be some mark of his passing, and yet nothing. A silence settled over the group, broken only by the distant toll of a clock striking 4. Holmes turned abruptly to the woman once more. Madam, did you hear anything? A struggle? A cry for help? She shook her head. Not a sound, sir. Not till them constables came running. Holmes exhaled softly. A man collapses in an alley, fear frozen on his face, and yet he makes no sound. His killer flees, but leaves no trace. He glanced down at the playing card still resting in his gloved hand. A puzzle with many pieces, but none yet fitting together. Lestrade crossed his arms. And what do you make of the card? Holmes studied it once more, his fingers tracing its worn edges. A message, surely, but its meaning is yet obscured. He turned to the body once more, his gaze flitting across the details he had already observed. But then something shifted, a flicker of realization in his eyes. His hand moved swiftly to the dead man's lapel, pinching at the fabric before, extracting something small and nearly imperceptible to the eye. A thin fibre no longer than a hair, dark as midnight. A peculiar thing, Holmes murmured, rolling the strand between his fingers. Hardly noticeable, and yet not belonging to the victim. Lestrade squinted. What is it? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the fibre closer to the light of a flickering gas lamp and studied it with narrowed eyes. Finally, he let out a breath that might have been amusement. Something most intriguing, he said, slipping it carefully into his coat pocket. Then, without another word, he turned sharply on his heel and strode toward the nearest street. I hurried after him. Holmes, where are you going? To find the next piece of the puzzle, Watson, and to confirm a suspicion that, if correct, will turn this case on its head. We moved swiftly through the fog-laden streets. the damp cobblestones slick beneath our steps. Holmes walked with a determination that I had come to recognize, a predator on the scent of its prey. The playing card still rested in his gloved fingers, turning idly as if the motion itself might coax the truth from its surface. He said little as we crossed into the heart of Whitechapel, his sharp gaze scanning the narrow alleys and shadowed corners with a restless intensity. It was not until we reached a modest pub, its wooden sign creaking in the cold wind, that he finally spoke. "Here," he murmured, "the man we seek is inside." I cast a wary glance at the building. It was the sort of place that clung to the edges of civility, a haven for dock workers, vagrants, and men with secrets. The murmur of voices seeped through the door, mingling with the occasional burst of raucous laughter. Holmes straightened his coat, pressed a hand to the brim of his hat, and stepped inside. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the stale scent of spilled ale. A handful of patrons sat scattered at worn wooden tables, their expressions ranging from weary indifference to wary curiosity at our entrance. Holmes wasted no time. His eyes swept the room once before settling on a man hunched near the corner, his fingers curled around a half-drained glass. "Mr. William Carter," Holmes announced, striding forward. The man stiffened. He was wiry, his face lined by a hard life, and his coat was a shade too fine for the likes of this establishment. His eyes flicked to the playing card in Holmes's grasp, and though he masked it quickly, I did not miss the brief flicker of recognition. "I don't know you," Carter said gruffly. "No, but you knew the man found dead in Blackthorn Alley," Holmes replied smoothly. He lowered himself into the seat opposite the man, his gaze never wavering. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, how does a respectable bookmaker such as yourself come to be involved in such an unfortunate affair?" Carter exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around his glass. "Bookmaker, is it? You flatter me, sir. I run a small game now and then, nothing more." Holmes tapped the playing card against the table. "And yet, your signature lies here, in ink." A muscle in Carter's jaw twitched. I know the card, but I don't know the man who held it last." Holmes smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in it. "And yet you react as though you do." Carter hesitated, glancing toward the barkeep as if weighing his options. "I'd heard of him," he admitted at last. Fellow was asking the wrong questions in the wrong places. Folk like that don't last long in Whitechapel. Holmes leaned forward. And what precisely was he asking? Carter hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly against the tabletop. He wanted names, people who move in the shadows. He weren't police, but he weren't just some common man neither. Had an air about him, like he knew more than he let on. Holmes studied him carefully. "And what did you tell him?" "Nothing," Carter said quickly. Too quickly. Holmes's smile widened. "And yet, Mr. Carter, I suspect that was not the end of your encounter." He reached into his pocket, retrieving the dark fibre he had plucked from the victim's coat. "Does this look familiar?" Carter's face darkened, but before he could answer, a voice cut through the murmur of the room. "You ask a great many questions, sir." We turned as a tall man stepped forward from the shadows near the hearth. He was well dressed, his suit a sharp contrast to the dim surroundings. His eyes were dark, calculating, and a faint smirk played at the corners of his lips. Holmes inclined his head. "And you are?" The man stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Holmes's. Elias Rourke, and I believe you are trespassing in matters best left untouched. Carter stiffened at the name, his face pale. Holmes, however, remained entirely at ease. "Ah, Mr. Rourke," he said lightly, "your reputation precedes you." The smirk on Rourke's face deepened. "I should hope so. But reputation alone is not always enough to dissuade meddling men." Holmes regarded him with quiet amusement. "And yet, here you are, eager to dissuade me." Rourke's eyes flicked to Carter, before returning to Holmes. "The dead man, whatever trouble he found, he brought upon himself. If you continue to dig, you may find yourself in a similar predicament." Holmes exhaled softly, as though amused by the threat. "A generous warning, but I must decline your advice." He rose smoothly from his seat, tucking the playing card into his coat. "Good evening, Mr. Rourke." The man's smirk never wavered, but there was a sharpness to his gaze as he watched Holmes turn toward the door. I hesitated only briefly before following, glancing once more at Carter, who sat frozen, his glass untouched. The cold night air met us as we stepped outside, but Holmes's pace did not falter. He moved swiftly, his thoughts already elsewhere. "Interesting," he murmured. Two men, each guarding their secrets, one fearful, the other entirely at ease. "What do you make of it?" I asked. Holmes glanced at me, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "That the game is far from over, Watson, and our next move must be made with great care." Holmes walked briskly through the dimly lit streets, his breath misting in the cold air, as he turned the night's events over in his mind. I followed closely, sensing the keen focus radiating from him, a sharp, unwavering intensity that signaled he was piecing the puzzle together, even if the full picture remained elusive. The man in the alley was no mere victim of chance, he said at last, his voice low but certain. He was seeking something, or perhaps someone, and his search cost him his life. I adjusted my coat against the chill. Carter and Rourke both seemed to know more than they were willing to say. Holmes gave a short nod. Carter is a man accustomed to walking the edge of the law, but fear has loosened his tongue. Rourke, however, presents an altogether different challenge. He is not a man who fears. That, Watson, makes him dangerous. We turned onto Baker Street, where the gas lamps cast long shadows against the buildings. Mrs. Hudson, ever the patient landlady, had left a small fire burning in the hearth, and I sank into my chair as Holmes paced before the mantel, his sharp gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "There are too many loose threads," I said, watching him. Carter's hesitation, Rourke's warning, and the playing card. What ties them together? Holmes turned on his heel. "What indeed? Our victim was no common gambler, that much is clear. But why seek out Carter? And why would Rourke involve himself in the matter at all?" I rubbed my chin. "Greed, perhaps. A debt gone wrong." Holmes's expression darkened. "An unsatisfactory answer. Carter may deal in wages, but men like Rourke do not concern themselves with trifling disputes. No, there is something larger at play." He strode toward his desk and retrieved a small ledger, flipping through its pages with practiced ease. "Whitechapel has been restless of late. Smuggling, blackmail, bribery. It is a den of many sins, but only a select few pull the strings." "And you believe Rourke to be one of them?" Holmes tapped a finger against the open book. "Rourke's name appears here, twice in the last 3 months. The first, an inquiry into a missing dock worker. The second, A police investigation that was abruptly closed without explanation. Tell me, Watson, what sort of man has the power to make an investigation disappear? I exhaled. A man with influence. Precisely. Holmes snapped the book shut. And yet, despite his reach, he saw fit to warn us rather than eliminate us outright. That suggests uncertainty on his part. Uncertainty? I frowned. About what? Holmes's gaze sharpened. About what we know. About what we might yet discover. A knock at the door interrupted us. Lestrade stepped inside, his face set with grim purpose. Holmes, I've another body. Holmes straightened. Connected? Lestrade sighed. Looks that way. Found in a tenement near the docks. Another one of your playing cards right beside the body. We wasted no time. The ride through the fog-drenched streets was silent, save for the distant echo of horse hooves and the occasional shout of a watchman. When we arrived, the building was in a sorry state, wood warped from years of damp, the stench of unwashed bodies lingering in the hall. The victim lay sprawled near the hearth of a cramped room, his clothes ragged, his face frozen in a grimace of pain. A single playing card rested near his outstretched hand, the jack of spades. Holmes crouched beside the body, studying it with narrowed eyes. Strangled, he murmured. No sign of struggle. Either he knew his killer, or he was too weak to fight. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. This one's name was Garrett Flynn. Dock worker, same as the last man. Holmes's expression darkened. Another man asking questions he shouldn't. I frowned. If this is connected, why escalate so quickly? Killing once is a risk, twice is desperation. Holmes's fingers skimmed the card's surface before he rose to his feet. It is not desperation, Watson. It is a message. Lestrade exhaled sharply. And what's the message? Holmes's gaze flickered toward the soot-streaked walls, the rotting furniture, the discarded bottles that hinted at a life of struggle. Then slowly he turned the card over, revealing a single mark in the corner, a faint imprint of a raven. The mark of the black feathers, he murmured. I stiffened. The black feathers, an elusive syndicate whispered about in the dark corners of London's underworld. They dealt in secrets, trading information as currency. It was said that once you crossed them, there was no escape. Lestrade scowled. If they're involved, we're in deeper than I thought. Holmes slipped the card into his pocket. Indeed. And the question remains. What were these men seeking that warranted their silence? Lestrade sighed. I'll question the usual informants. Someone must know why they were asking about. Holmes shook his head. No, Lestrade. The answer does not lie in the docks. It lies with Rourke. He is the only piece on this board that does not fit. Lestrade hesitated, then nodded. I'll see what I can dig up. As he departed, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. Tonight, Watson, we rest. Tomorrow we confront Elias Rourke. The following morning, the air carried the promise of rain, a damp chill clinging to the streets as Holmes and I made our way toward Rourke's estate. It was a grand structure, its imposing stone facade rising like a fortress against the London skyline. The man who resided within wielded influence like a weapon, and as we approached, I felt an uneasy tension settle in my chest. Holmes, however, seemed unbothered, his mind already working several moves ahead, anticipating the inevitable clash. The butler who answered the door regarded us with the practiced indifference of a man accustomed to turning away unwanted guests. "Mr. Rourke is not receiving visitors," he intoned. Holmes stepped forward, slipping a small note into the man's gloved hand. "Tell him it is a matter of some urgency," he said, his voice cool, measured. The butler hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the note. I caught the briefest flash of recognition before he stepped aside, motioning for us to enter. We were led through a vast hall adorned with oil paintings and marble busts, the air thick with the scent of cigar smoke and aged wood. Finally, we arrived at a study where Elias Rourke stood by the fireplace, his silhouette cast long against the flickering flames. He turned as we entered, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted, his voice smooth, deliberate. "Dr. Watson, what an unexpected pleasure." Holmes strode forward, his sharp gaze taking in every detail. The half-empty glass of brandy, the discarded newspaper bearing the latest reports on the Whitechapel murders, the faint indentation in the carpet where a second chair had recently been occupied. "We have unfinished business, Mr. Rourke," Holmes said. "I trust you are a man who dislikes loose ends." Rourke chuckled, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Ah, but some ends are best left untied, don't you think?" Holmes tilted his head. "And yet 2 men are dead, and a third may soon follow. The black feathers do not leave debts unpaid." A flicker of something passed through Rourke's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or the briefest trace of unease. "You assume much, Mr. Holmes, but let us speak plainly. What is it you want?" Holmes reached into his coat and retrieved the playing card, the Jack of Spades. He held it between 2 fingers, letting the firelight catch the faint imprint of the raven in the corner. Rourke's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a barely perceptible tension coiling beneath the surface. "A curious trinket," he murmured. Holmes stepped closer. "A signature, Mr. Rourke. One that has appeared twice now, each time beside a corpse." Rourke exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the mantelpiece. "You fancy yourself a hunter, Mr. Holmes. But tell me, what do you do when the trail leads you straight into the jaws of the beast?" Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "You learn to see the beast for what it is." Before Rourke could respond, a sharp rap on the door interrupted the moment. The butler entered, his face drawn. "Apologies, sir, but Inspector Lestrade has arrived. He insists it is urgent." Holmes and I exchanged a glance before following Rourke into the foyer, where Lestrade stood, his features alight with triumph. "Gentlemen, I believe we've got him." Rourke raised a brow. "Have you now?" Lestrade nodded. "A suspect was caught trying to leave London last night. James Carter." I felt my breath hitch. "Carter? The bookmaker?" "The same," Lestrade confirmed. "We searched his lodgings and found this." He reached into his coat and produced another playing card, identical to the ones left at the crime scenes. Rourke smirked. Well, it seems your hunter has found his prey, Mr. Holmes." Holmes, however, remained silent, his gaze fixed on the card in Lestrade's hand. Something about it troubled him. I could see it in the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his fingers twitched at his side. Lestrade continued, unaware of Holmes's hesitation. "With his record, the courts won't take long. We'll have him charged before the week is out." I exhaled, feeling the weight of the past days finally lift. But Holmes remained unmoved. As we left Rourke's estate and stepped back into the cold morning air, I turned to him. Surely this is good news. Holmes's jaw tightened. It is convenient news, I frowned. You doubt his guilt? I doubt the simplicity of it, he muttered. Carter was a man desperate to save his own skin. If he were the true killer, why run? Why not strike again? And why, Watson, would he leave behind the very evidence that would condemn him? I hesitated. Perhaps he panicked. Perhaps, Holmes murmured. But I could tell the theory did not sit well with him. His mind was already moving beyond Carter, searching the shadows for the hand that had placed him in the gallows. 2 days later, as the papers hailed the case as solved and the city exhaled in relief, another body was found. Another playing card, another jack of spades, and just like that, the beast in the shadows stirred once more. The discovery of another body shattered the illusion of resolution, sending a chill through London's underbelly. The ink on the newspapers had barely dried, proclaiming James Carter as the culprit, when the truth clawed its way back to the surface. Holmes had known, of course. The moment Lestrade brandished that second jack of spades, a forgery in its own right, he had sensed the deception. Now, with another victim lying cold in the morgue, the hunt had only just begun. We stood in the dim confines of the mortuary, the scent of antiseptic barely masking the underlying presence of death. The body, a man in his late 30s, bore familiar signs, precise lacerations, deliberate positioning, and there, just as before, the calling card lay beside him. But this time, something was different. Holmes studied the card in silence, his fingers tracing its edges. A mistake, he murmured. I leaned in. How so? He turned the card over, revealing a faint smudge along the corner. Not ink, not blood. Something else. Carter's card was pristine, Watson, too pristine, as though it had been planted rather than left in haste. But this... He lifted the card closer to the dim light, his eyes narrowing. This one bears the mark of a hurried hand. Lestrade sighed, rubbing his temple. Then you believe Carter was innocent? Innocent of the murders, yes, Holmes replied. Guilty, however, of being the perfect scapegoat. Lestrade muttered a curse under his breath. Then we're back to nothing. Not nothing, Holmes corrected, slipping the card into, his coat. We're back to where we should have started. We left the mortuary with urgency, the weight of the night pressing upon us. The cold bit through my coat as we hailed a cab, the gas lamps flickering like spectres in the fog. Holmes sat in deep thought, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. This isn't new, he said suddenly. I glanced at him. What do you mean? The precision, the staging, the calling card, it's all too refined. This isn't the work of a man striking out for the first time. It's practiced, methodical. I frowned. But the black feathers are a convenient myth, Holmes interrupted. A veil for something older, something buried. He withdrew a notebook from his coat, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. A decade ago, a series of murders plagued London's East End. The victims, all men of ill repute, were found mutilated in a manner not unlike our present case. At the time, the killings were attributed to gang violence, a turf war among thieves. But the details, Watson, he tapped the pages, they tell a different story. I leaned closer, scanning the notes he had scrawled. The names of the victims, the locations, the patterns. Then a name caught my eye. Elias Rourke. Holmes's expression darkened. The last known victim. Found dead in his estate under mysterious circumstances. The case was closed hastily, ruled a suicide. I exhaled. And now we have his son, Elias Rourke Jr., standing at the center of all this. Holmes nodded. The sins of the father, Watson. I suspect we've been looking at this all wrong. This isn't merely about power or greed. It's about legacy, a vendetta born in the shadows of the past. The cab lurched to a stop outside 221B Baker Street. Holmes stepped out first, his movements sharp with purpose. We ascended the stairs, quickly, entering the warmth of our sitting room. He wasted no time, pulling volumes from his shelves, rifling through papers, reconstructing a timeline that had been long forgotten by London's authorities. Lestrade arrived an hour later, his coat damp from the misty air. "What have you got?" Holmes motioned for him to sit. "A connection," he said. "One that predates the recent murders by 10 years. Lestrade leaned forward as Holmes spread out the documents. These men, all of them tied to the old criminal networks of London, were killed in the same manner. The last name on that list, Elias Rourke. His death was the final act of a story that was never fully told. Lestrade frowned. "You're saying someone has picked up where it left off?" Holmes nodded, "or never stopped." I felt a slow dread settle over me. "Then who, Holmes?" He exhaled, his gaze drifting to the window where the fog curled, against the glass like a living thing. "That, Watson, is the question that will lead us to the true killer." Holmes sat in his chair, fingers pressed together, eyes closed, as if listening to something the rest of us could not hear. The dim gaslight flickered over the cluttered table, maps, police reports, notes scribbled in haste. The air in 221B, Baker Street felt dense, thick with unsaid conclusions waiting to be drawn. Lestrade paced the room, his frustration evident in the sharpness of his steps. I sat across from Holmes, watching the slow inhale and exhale of his breath, knowing that, beneath his stillness, his mind was a storm. Then, abruptly, his eyes opened. "We have been asking the wrong questions," he said, his voice smooth yet edged with certainty. Lestrade stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "We have sought the who and the why," Holmes continued, "but we have overlooked something far more fundamental." "How?" I frowned. "The method of the crime?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, the method of the lie." Lestrade exhaled. "You'll have to speak plain, Holmes. We don't have time for riddles." Holmes stood, moving to the fireplace, where the embers cast shifting shadows across his face. "The truth is like glass. Even when forged into an imitation, it will always reflect light differently than the original." He turned, his gaze sharp. "I need to see them again, all of them." Lestrade sighed. "You mean the suspects?" "Yes," Holmes said simply. "And this time, we will not ask questions. We will show them the truth they expect to see and observe the moment their own reflection betrays them." An hour later, we convened at Scotland Yard. The interrogation room was cold, its walls bare, its wooden table stained by years of quiet confessions and silent resistance. The suspects sat separately, Elias Rourke Jr., whose name now carried the weight of old sins, Margaret Lyle, the widow too composed in her mourning, and Peter Gaines, the man with an alibi too neat, too rehearsed. Holmes entered first, his demeanor uncharacteristically relaxed. "Good evening," he said, setting his coat aside and folding his sleeves. "Before we begin, I should inform you that this is no longer a matter of speculation. The case is solved. A shift, subtle, but there. Elias Rourke leaned back, arms crossed. Margaret Lyle exhaled just a fraction too slowly. Peter Gaines blinked twice, his fingers twitching. Holmes smiled. "Oh, don't look so concerned. We are simply tying up loose ends before the announcement." Lestrade, playing along, grumbled, "Waste of time, if you ask me." Holmes ignored him, producing a deck of cards from his pocket. Not the playing kind. These bore illustrations, letters, symbols. He shuffled them absent-mindedly. "You see, deception is a rather fragile thing. It requires maintenance, effort, and the more intricate the lie, the more it strains under scrutiny." He dealt a card in front of each suspect. "A final test, if you will." Elias Rourke glanced at his card, an ink drawing of a key. Margaret Lyle's bore the image of a raven. Peter Gaines stared at his, an hourglass. Holmes watched them with the gaze of a hunter. "Curious symbols, wouldn't you say?" He turned to Lestrade. "These were found at the scene. Not the playing cards, as we originally thought. No, something else entirely." Lestrade, quick on the uptake, folded his arms. "Right, we found them in Carter's belongings." The room grew tighter. The silence between breaths became a force of its own. Holmes, ever so casually, picked up the keycard. "The curious thing about symbols," he mused, "is their meaning changes depending on who is looking at them." Margaret Lyle tilted her head, her lips parting as if to speak, but she hesitated. Holmes set the card down and turned to Elias Rourke. "And some symbols, well, they are more personal than others." Flicker, barely there but enough. Elias's jaw clenched. Holmes continued, his voice light, almost playful. "It's remarkable, isn't it? The human mind's inability to hide recognition. It is one thing to lie with words, but the body betrays even the most disciplined of liars." He turned to Peter Gaines. "Wouldn't you agree?" Gaines swallowed. I don't know what you're talking about." Holmes smiled. "Of course you do." He tapped the hourglass card. "This, for instance, tells me more than you realize." I frowned, glancing at Lestrade. Even I wasn't sure where Holmes was going with this. Holmes leaned forward. "You hesitated when you saw it. Not confusion, recognition. A hesitation too brief to be conscious, but too telling to ignore." Gaines shifted. "It's a drawing of an hourglass, nothing more." Holmes tilted his head. "Yes, indeed. An hourglass. A symbol of time running out." His voice lowered, measured. "Or perhaps of a deal made under constraint." Gaines went still. Holmes turned the card over, revealing what he had hidden on the back, a name. One that had not been spoken in the interrogation before. "Care to explain why this belonged to Henry Kettering?" The reaction was immediate. Gaines exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. Lestrade stepped forward. "Gaines, you'd best start talking." Holmes leaned back, satisfied. "You see, gentlemen, the truth is often an inconvenient thing. But deception, it only takes one crack before the whole facade collapses." Lestrade barked orders to his men, sending them scrambling to track down Sergeant Whitmore. Holmes, however, remained still, his eyes fixed on the smudged signature, his mind weaving through possibilities. The theft of the ledger was not a simple act of desperation. It was deliberate, controlled, Someone had been waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, before another word could be spoken, the commotion began. A frantic shout from the hallway, the rapid thud of boots against the floor. Lestrade turned sharply as another constable appeared in the doorway, breathless, his face pale. "There's been another incident." Holmes straightened. "Where?" "Not far," the constable said, swallowing hard. "A body found in an alley 2 streets over. It's Sergeant Whitmore." A cold silence followed. Then Lestrade cursed under his breath and pushed past the constable, leading the charge out of the evidence room. Holmes and I followed, the weight of the moment pressing against us. Whoever had stolen the ledger had made certain that Whitmore would never explain how or why it had vanished. By the time we reached the alley, the scene was already drawing a small crowd. The body lay crumpled against the damp brick wall, one hand outstretched as though reaching for something that had never come. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading, the metallic scent thick in the cold night air. A single bullet wound marred his chest, the shot clean and precise. Lestrade knelt beside him, jaw clenched. "Damn it," he muttered. "A warning. Or a loose end?" Holmes crouched as well, his fingers grazing the edge of Whitmore's coat. Then, with a swift and deliberate motion, he reached into the sergeant's inner pocket and retrieved something, a scrap of paper, folded tightly. He unfolded it with care. The paper was thin, damp in places, but the ink remained legible. They know. "The truth is buried deep. If you find this, don't trust." The sentence cut off in a streak of red, where Whitmore's blood had smeared the rest of the message. I exhaled sharply. He knew something, and whoever got to him made sure he wouldn't say it aloud. Holmes's expression was unreadable, but his grip on the paper tightened ever so slightly. He rose to his feet, his gaze sweeping the alley with sharp intent. The shot was precise, close range. The killer didn't need to chase him. They were waiting. Lestrade nodded grimly. "Means Whitmore was already running scared. He knew he was being hunted." Holmes turned the paper over, searching for anything more, but the back was blank. He exhaled, slipping it into his coat. "Someone is cutting the threads before we can follow them. The ledger is gone, and the man who last held it is dead." He glanced toward the mouth of the alley, his expression darkening. "But whoever did this, they're not finished yet." Lestrade frowned. "You think they'll strike again?" Holmes gave a single, measured nod. "They've already taken risks. They won't hesitate if they believe we are closing in." A fresh urgency settled over us. This was no longer just about solving a murder. It was about stopping the next one before it was too late. Holmes stood at the mouth of the alley, eyes half-lidded, lost in the labyrinth of his own thoughts. The rain had picked up, soft and misting, carrying the scent of damp stone and something more elusive, the remnants of fear. Sergeant Whitmore's death had been swift, calculated, but there was something about it that nagged at the edges of reason, something misplaced. The killer had been careful, erasing his own steps, yet not careful enough to stop Whitmore from leaving behind that note. They know. The truth is buried deep. Lestrade turned to one of his men. "Get a list of Whitmore's recent cases. I want to know who he was dealing with before this." Holmes didn't respond to the order, though his mind was already ahead of it. His fingers tapped idly against his forearm, a steady rhythm, his thoughts moving even faster. There had been too many moving pieces, too many distractions. The missing ledger, the vanishing evidence, the murder of the one man who might have known why. It felt erratic, but no crime was without structure. No killer was without a pattern. He turned sharply. "Watson, recall the day the first body was discovered." I frowned, caught off guard. "What about it?" The inspector's reaction. Lestrade raised a brow. "My reaction?" Holmes ignored him. "When we first arrived at the crime scene, before the body was even fully examined, you noted something peculiar." His gaze sharpened, fixed on me. "You said there was an odd lack of blood, did you not?" I hesitated. "Yes, but we assumed it was simply a matter of positioning, or perhaps a post-mortem factor. But what if it wasn't?" He turned on his heel, pacing. "And Whitmore's death, one bullet precise at close range, no sign of struggle." Lestrade crossed his arms. "You think it's the same hand behind both?" Holmes exhaled, measured, controlled. "I think we've been looking at the pieces separately when they are, in fact, part of a whole." He glanced toward the body again, eyes narrowing. "This is not merely a cover-up. It's a message. And yet—" I watched him closely. He was working through something, an unseen thread tying it all together, but it hadn't yet revealed itself in full. Then suddenly, he stopped. "Watson," he said, voice low but certain, "the pocket watch." I blinked. "What?" "The first victim, do you recall? He had a pocket watch in his vest." I searched my memory. "Yes, but what of it?" Holmes's gaze darkened, a flicker of understanding flashing behind his eyes. "It was set to the wrong time," Lestrade scoffed. "A broken watch, hardly—" "No," Holmes cut in, his voice sharper now. "Not broken, adjusted." The realization settled over me like a slow-moving shadow. "You think it was deliberate?" Holmes turned, and in that instant I saw it. The moment when his mind, sharper than any blade, pieced together what had been staring us in the face. "All along, the pocket watch was set back precisely 13 minutes, he said. "Not an accident, not a coincidence, a mark." He exhaled. "And now Whitmore is dead, his note unfinished, cut off." He looked to me then, the weight of the discovery pressing against him. "Because the truth is buried 13 minutes deep." I shivered. The pattern had been there all along, waiting for us to see it. And now, whoever was behind this knew we were closing in. Holmes stood utterly still, his mind turning over the realization, dissecting it, testing its weight. 13 minutes. It had been in front of us all along. An intentional delay, an artificial gap in time. But why? What could be so crucial about those missing minutes? Lestrade exhaled sharply. "You're saying the killer set the watch back? On purpose? To what end?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered with calculation, but there was something else too, something colder, something deeper. "The question is not why the watch was set back," he murmured, "but who needed those 13 minutes, and what they used them for." A ripple of silence passed between us. The rain had slowed, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the gaslights, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something less tangible, an unease, a disturbance, in the balance of things. Then, as if jolted by some unseen force, Holmes turned on his heel. "Whitmore's note. The truth is buried deep." He wasn't speaking in metaphor, he was telling us where to look. Lestrade frowned. "You think he meant the first body?" Holmes's voice was sharp as a blade. The answer isn't in what was stolen, what was erased. It's in what was left behind. The body itself is the evidence. It took a moment for his meaning to sink in. Then a chilling realization coiled in my gut. You believe something was hidden inside the victim? Holmes met my gaze, and in his eyes I saw the grim certainty of a man who had glimpsed the shape of the truth before the world was ready for it. The missing ledger, he murmured. The records that vanished without a trace. What if they weren't destroyed at all? What if they were concealed in the one place no one would dare to look? Lestrade's face paled. You're suggesting, I'm stating, Holmes corrected, that our murderer wasn't just covering his key tracks. He was orchestrating a delay. The 13-minute gap wasn't about the moment of death. It was about after. A window of time in which to tamper with the body before anyone arrived. His voice dropped lower. And if I am correct, that means this entire game, the murders, the missing evidence, the mounting chaos, it's all been about what was hidden inside that corpse. A sickening tension thickened the air. I had seen many brutalities in my time, but this was something else. This was precision. This was design. Lestrade swallowed hard. So what now? Holmes's gaze was already ahead of us. Now we returned to the morgue. The trip back was swift but heavy, the weight of revelation pressing against us. The city stretched wide and dark, indifferent to the horrors lurking beneath its surface. When we arrived, the mortuary was still and silent, the cold slabs gleaming under the dim lighting. The coroner, an older man with tired eyes, looked up from his desk as we entered. "Back again, gentlemen?" he asked, though there was little curiosity in his voice. Holmes nodded curtly. "I need access to the first victim." The coroner sighed. Inspector Lestrade already examined him. Nothing new came up. Holmes's tone sharpened. "We are not looking for something new. We are looking for what was always there." The coroner hesitated, then gestured for us to follow. Moments later, the body lay before us once more, pale, still, silent. And yet, if Holmes was right, this was not just a corpse. This was a cipher, a message. Holmes donned gloves, his movements swift but careful. "Watson, assist me." I stepped forward as he traced his fingers along the victim's torso, his touch seeking, searching, until he froze. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "There." I followed his gaze. A faint, almost imperceptible incision along the rib cage. At first glance, it seemed no different from the standard post-mortem examination cuts, but as Holmes pressed lightly along the skin, something shifted beneath it. Lestrade leaned in, his breath tight. "What the devil?" Holmes reached for a scalpel, and with precise hands he reopened the incision. A moment later his fingers withdrew, holding something small and wrapped in oilcloth. Carefully he peeled it back. What lay inside was a bundle of papers folded tightly, the ink still crisp despite their gruesome hiding place. And as he spread them out before us, the truth spilled into the cold air like a long-buried ghost. Names, transactions, dates, and at the bottom, one signature. One name that tied everything together. Lestrade inhaled sharply. Good God! It was the name of a man who had sat in every interrogation, who had spoken carefully, who had played his part to perfection. A man who had stood in the shadows, guiding every turn of this case. Holmes's voice was cold and final. The true motive was never money, never power. It was control. and the one man who stood to lose everything if the truth came to light. I exhaled. The weight of it, crushing, was the one we least suspected. The air inside 221B Baker Street was heavy with thought, thick with the weight of certainty. The papers lay spread across the table, the ink shimmering under the lamplight. Holmes stood by the window, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable as the city hummed beyond the glass. Lestrade paced, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor, each step a collision of disbelief and fury. This can't be right. His voice was low, taut with restraint. Not him. Holmes's gaze did not waver. And yet the ink does not lie. I exhaled slowly, my own mind struggling to reconcile the reality before us. The name at the bottom of the ledger, scrawled in a familiar practiced hand, belonged to none other than Sir Reginald Carraway, a man of impeccable standing, a man who had guided this very investigation with measured authority. The same man who had been present at every crime scene, his words shaping the course of our inquiry. The one we had trusted to deliver justice. Lestrade's hands curled into fists. So what's our move? An arrest? Holmes finally turned, his features chiseled from something sharper than stone. No, Carraway is too careful for that. If we confront him with nothing but paper, he will laugh in our faces. He needs to believe he is untouchable. A glint of something dangerous flickered in his eyes. We need him to reveal himself. The invitation was sent under the guise of civility. A private meeting, a discussion among gentlemen to assess the progress of the case. The setting? The Grand Metropole Club, a sanctuary of the elite, where reputations were built and destroyed over brandy and cigar smoke. Carraway arrived precisely on time. Dressed in a dark overcoat, a silk cravat pinned in place with a modest pearl, he exuded quiet confidence. His expression was calm, as it always was, his gaze measured as he greeted us with the warmth of an old friend. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, settling into the high-backed leather chair. "I trust we have made some progress?" Holmes offered, a small smile, the kind that suggested amusement at some private joke. "Indeed, Sir Reginald. Progress in leaps and bounds." A waiter arrived, pouring whiskey into crystal tumblers. Holmes waited until the man had retreated before he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "I must say, this case has been rather illuminating." Carraway tilted his head, the perfect picture of curiosity. "How so?" Lestrade said nothing, his jaw set, his fingers drumming once against the armrest. Holmes swirled the whiskey in his glass. "Patterns, Sir Reginald. That is what this entire affair has been, a series of carefully woven patterns. The theft of records disguised as murder, the timing of events designed to mislead, the placement of bodies to send a message." His eyes lifted, piercing. "But in every pattern there is a flaw, a single thread that unravels the entire tapestry." Carraway chuckled softly. "And you believe you've found such a flaw?" Holmes took a slow sip of his drink. "I know I have." For the first time, a flicker of something shifted in Carraway's expression. Subtle, barely perceptible. But, there Holmes set his glass down gently, the missing ledger was never destroyed, it was hidden. And tonight it sits safely in Scotland Yard's possession. Lestrade leaned forward. "With your name at the bottom." The moment stretched, taut as a violin string. Carraway did not speak, did not move. The world outside the club continued. as it always had, oblivious to the storm brewing within these walls. Then, a slow exhale. "I see." His voice was quiet, devoid of the usual polish. He reached for his whiskey, taking a measured sip before setting it down with a deliberate clink. "And what, pray, do you intend to do with this revelation?" Holmes watched him carefully. "That depends entirely on you." A shadow of a smile ghosted across Carraway's lips. "Ah, and here I thought you had the upper hand, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade tensed. The shift was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. The way Carraway's fingers flexed slightly, the faint adjustment in his posture. He was assessing, calculating. Holmes remained unshaken. There is no upper hand when one plays against a man who believes himself above the game. The question is, Sir Reginald, do you still believe yourself untouchable? Carraway's expression did not falter. But there, just there, I saw it. The faintest flicker of something beneath his carefully crafted mask. And then, in a single fluid motion, he was reaching for something beneath his coat. Lestrade was faster. The room exploded into motion, the chair scraping violently against the floor as he lunged forward, seizing Carraway's wrist and slamming it against the table. A pistol clattered onto the polished wood, the sound like a gunshot in the heavy silence. The club's patrons turned in surprise, but Holmes was already on his feet, his voice calm but firm. "I wouldn't advise it, Sir Reginald." Carraway exhaled through his nose, his composure returning like a mask, slipping back into place. "You always were thorough, Mr. Holmes." Lestrade retrieved the weapon, his grip tight. "Reginald Carraway, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice and murder." Carraway did not resist as Lestrade pulled him to his feet, but as he straightened his coat, he fixed Holmes with a look that sent a chill through the air. "You think this is over?" he murmured, his voice silk over steel. "But you have no idea how deep this truly goes." Holmes's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I never do, Sir Reginald, but that is what makes the game so very interesting." The carriage rattled over the cobblestone streets as the city pulsed with its usual indifference. Rain drizzled against the windows, blurring the gaslit world outside into a smear of gold and shadow. Inside, Lestrade sat rigidly across from Holmes and me, his expression set in grim satisfaction. "That's the end of it then," he muttered, wiping a weary hand down his face. "Reginald Carraway, of all people. Who'd have thought?" Holmes said nothing, his fingers resting lightly against his chin, his eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the rain-streaked glass. I had seen this look before, the quiet churning of a mind that was not yet satisfied. Lestrade exhaled. "Well, with him in custody, the Yard will be busy untangling the rest of it. A fine night's work, I'd say." Still, Holmes remained silent. I leaned forward. "Something troubles you." Holmes blinked once, the only indication that he had heard me. "Does it not strike you as strange, Watson?" His voice was soft, distant. Carraway, calm, calculating, meticulous. A man who controlled every aspect of this crime from the shadows. And yet when confronted he reaches for a pistol like a common street thief caught in the act, Lestrade scoffed. "Desperation does odd things to men, Holmes." He knew he was caught. Holmes turned his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Did he?" The question hung in the air. A bead of water traced its way down the window pane, twisting and turning before vanishing into the sill. The carriage slowed, pulling up to 221B Baker Street. Holmes stepped out first, his movements swift, purposeful. I followed, exchanging a glance with Lestrade, who sighed before trudging after us. Inside, Holmes moved like a man chasing a ghost, his hands skimming over papers, his eyes scanning every note, every detail, as if searching for something that had eluded him. Lestrade sank into a chair. "Holmes, you've won. It's done. What in God's name are you looking for?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he strode toward the fireplace, where the embers still glowed faintly. He reached for the poker, stirring the ashes until something caught his eye, a slip of charred parchment, edges curled from the heat. With careful fingers, he plucked it out and examined what little remained. Then, without a word, he crossed the room, retrieved a magnifying glass, and studied the faint traces of ink. A pause. Then, very softly, "No." Lestrade sat up. "No. What do you mean, no?" Holmes turned, his face suddenly alight with something sharp and dangerous. "We were meant to catch Carraway." I felt a cold prickle along my spine. "Meant to?" Holmes stepped forward, the parchment still in his grip. "He wanted us to. He let us uncover his involvement, Watson. He let us believe we had won." Lestrade scoffed. "Rubbish. We saw the evidence with our own eyes." Holmes's voice was dangerously calm. "Exactly. He let us see it." A silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of realization. I swallowed. "Then the real mastermind?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Still out there." The word sent a chill through the room. Lestrade stood abruptly, his hands braced against the table. "That's a bold claim, Holmes. You're saying Carraway was a pawn?" "A willing one," Holmes murmured. "Which means the true architect of this crime is far more clever, far more dangerous than we imagined." A sudden knock at the door cut through the tension. We all turned as Mrs. Hudson appeared, her expression wary. "A message just arrived," she said, holding out a neatly folded note. Holmes took it, his eyes scanning the contents. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted. A slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers pressed against the paper. He handed it to me. The message was brief. "A game well played, Mr. Holmes, but the board is not yet cleared. There is one piece left. Find it before it finds you." There was no signature, no indication of the sender, only the faint, lingering scent of a familiar perfume. Holmes stood motionless, his fingers still pressed against the note, as if the ink itself might yield some unspoken truth. The air in the room thickened with an unspoken tension, a silent recognition that this was far from over. Lestrade exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "So what now? Another chase? Another dead-end lead?" Holmes tilted his head slightly, his gaze fixed on the note. "No. Now we unravel the game entirely." I watched as he moved toward his desk with deliberate precision, his mind clearly racing through the possibilities. He retrieved the burnt scrap from the fireplace and placed it beside the note, his eyes narrowing. "Carraway played his part well," Holmes murmured. "Too well," Lestrade scoffed. "He confessed, Holmes. Stood right there in the interrogation room and because he was meant to." Holmes's voice was like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "You mistake admission for guilt, Lestrade. He wasn't confessing out of defeat, he was following a script." Lestrade hesitated, his frown deepening. Then who's behind it all? Holmes tapped a finger against the note. Someone who wanted us looking at Caraway. Someone who let us pull at the thread just long enough to think we had unraveled the tapestry, and yet... His eyes lifted, gleaming with something between fascination and dread. It remains intact. I swallowed. And the perfume? Holmes smiled, but there was no amusement in it. That, Watson, is what makes this truly interesting. He turned suddenly, snatching his coat from the chair and sweeping it over his shoulders in one fluid motion. Come, there is one move left on the board. Lestrade grumbled but followed without argument, and soon we were back in the carriage, cutting through the fog-laden streets of London. The city seemed different now, colder, more watchful. I felt the weight of unseen eyes at every turn, as though the true villain was watching, waiting, perhaps even amused at our efforts. Holmes remained silent the entire ride, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, lost in thought. Then, without warning, he spoke.
Watson, recall the night we visited Caraway's office. There was an oil lamp on the desk, half full. I frowned. Yes. And yet, the wick was completely unused. The realization struck me like a blow. Someone had refilled it after it had burned down.
Holmes nodded. Precisely. A simple detail easily overlooked. But why refill a lamp you have no intention of using? Lestrade exhaled in exasperation. You're speaking in riddles, Holmes. Am I? He leaned forward slightly. That lamp was a message, Lestrade. Not from Caraway, but from the one who framed him. The carriage lurched to a stop outside a grand townhouse in Kensington. The gas lights flickered against the iron railings, casting long, shifting shadows against the stone steps. Holmes stepped out first, his movements careful, measured. We followed close behind, our footsteps muffled against the damp pavement. Holmes reached the door and, without hesitation, rapped 3 times. A long pause. Then a click of a lock. The door swung open just enough to reveal a pair of striking green eyes, sharp and knowing. Mr. Holmes, the woman murmured, her voice laced with amusement. I was beginning to think you'd never come. Lestrade stiffened. Who the devil? Irene Adler, Holmes said softly. The name hung in the air like a ghost. Adler smiled, stepping back to allow us in. Well, don't stand out there in the cold. We entered cautiously, the air inside thick with the scent of jasmine and something darker beneath it. Something unmistakably dangerous. Adler moved gracefully to the fireplace, where a fresh log burned low, casting flickering light against the walls. So, she mused, turning to face us. What took you so long? Holmes removed his hat, his expression unreadable. You orchestrated the entire affair. A slow smile. Did I? Holmes stepped forward. Caraway was a distraction. You fed him just enough information to make him believe he was the mastermind. You made sure we found the right evidence, pushed us toward the right conclusions, because it was all part of your design. Adler tilted her head. And why, pray, would I do such a thing? Holmes's eyes darkened. Because Caraway was in your way. His business, his influence, his hold on certain individuals. He was a threat to something you wanted. But if you removed him yourself, the weight of suspicion would fall upon you. Lestrade tensed. So you let us do the work for you. Adler's smile did not falter. You wound me, gentlemen. She moved to the side table, pouring a measure of brandy into a glass. If I were truly behind all this, would I have left such obvious clues? Holmes watched her carefully. You would if you wanted to be found. A silence stretched between them, charged and electric. Then Adler sighed. You always were too clever for your own good. She reached into her pocket. Lestrade flinched, his hand darting toward his revolver, but she only pulled out a folded document and extended it toward Holmes. A confession of sorts, she murmured. Holmes took it, unfolding the paper with precise fingers. His eyes skimmed the words, and for the first time that evening his breath caught, so briefly that only I, who knew him best, noticed. Lestrade leaned forward. What is it? Holmes exhaled. Proof that Carraway was involved in a far greater conspiracy than we imagined, and a list of names. Dangerous ones. Adler sipped her brandy. He was a necessary casualty. Lestrade's jaw clenched. You killed him, she smiled, but her eyes were unreadable. Did I? Holmes folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his coat. You played your game well, Miss Adler, but tell me. He tilted his head. Why give this to me? Adler stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Because, Mr. Holmes, even the best players know when to leave. The table! Before Lestrade could react, she reached behind her, pulling a small lever on the fireplace mantel. A hidden panel swung open, revealing a passage beyond, and in a breath, she was gone. Lestrade lunged forward, but Holmes caught his arm. No, Lestrade. His voice was calm, final. Lestrade wrenched free. She confessed, she revealed. Holmes corrected. Which is not the same as surrendering. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. So she escapes. Holmes smiled faintly. For now. Lestrade shook his head. Damn it, Holmes. She played us. Holmes turned toward the fire, his gaze distant. She played them. And as the embers crackled softly, I realized the truth. Justice had been served, but not by our hands. And somewhere, in the vast city of London, Irene Adler had vanished. Into the night, one step ahead of us all. The embers in the fireplace had begun to dim, their glow casting restless shadows along the walls. Lestrade stood stiffly, jaw clenched, his fists curling and uncurling at his sides. Holmes, in stark contrast, was unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on the secret passage where Irene Adler had vanished into the darkness. She got away, Lestrade muttered, shaking his head. Again. Holmes turned slightly, his expression unreadable. Did she? I exhaled, still unsettled by the way it had all unfolded. She had this planned from the start, Holmes. Every step, every move, it was all calculated. A faint smile touched his lips, though there was no amusement in it. Precisely, Lestrade threw up his hands. Then what in God's name are we still doing standing here? We should be after her. Holmes finally moved, brushing the soot from his sleeves as he strode toward the desk. He retrieved the folded paper Adler had left behind, turning it over, in his fingers as though weighing its true value. Tell me, Lestrade, do you believe in absolute victories? Lestrade's frown deepened. What? Holmes sighed, slipping the paper into his coat. Even in the greatest games of strategy, there is no true conclusion, only the illusion of one. He glanced toward the hidden passage. Adler did not flee in desperation. She left precisely when she intended to. And what does that mean? I asked. Holmes was already moving toward the door. It means we are not the only ones with unfinished business. The night air was sharp as we stepped out onto the street. The city had begun to settle into its midnight hush, though the gaslights still flickered in their eternal vigil. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rolled over cobblestone, its wheels rattling in the quiet. Lestrade let out a long breath. Fine. She's gone. But at least we have this. He patted his coat, where he had tucked away the names from Adler's list. This is enough to put some very dangerous people in shackles. Holmes glanced at him but said nothing. I recognized that look immediately, a quiet wariness, a thought unspoken. What is it, Holmes? He kept walking, his hands clasped behind his back. I'm considering a contradiction, Watson, Lestrade groaned. Not tonight, Holmes. We've done our part. Holmes barely seemed to hear him. The note she left, it was deliberate, too deliberate. His voice took on the tone of a man unraveling a puzzle in real time. Irene Adler does not leave loose ends. And yet she left this, Lestrade scowled. And we've seen criminals get careless before. Holmes gave him a sidelong glance. Irene Adler is not careless. Something cold settled in my chest. You think the document is a deception? Holmes did not answer immediately. He stopped near the corner, where the street curved into a mist-laden alley, the gaslight flickering uncertainly overhead. Then, after a moment, he pulled the paper from his coat and unfolded it once more. The writing was precise, the ink dry. Every name was accounted for, each one damning in its own. Right. But something about the arrangement, the way the words sat on the page, troubled him. He ran a gloved finger over the parchment, as if feeling for something unseen. Then his eyes flicked upward, sharp and knowing. She wanted us to find this, he murmured. She needed us to, Lestrade huffed. Well, congratulations to her then. We did. Holmes ignored him, turning the page over. The back was blank. He held it up to the lamplight. No hidden marks, no invisible ink. And yet, his eyes narrowed. Watson, your notebook. I fumbled in my coat, pulling it free. Holmes took it, flipping to a blank page before pressing the document against it. Then, with careful precision, he ran his fingers along the edges, applying the faintest pressure. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly, an imprint began to emerge. A single word. Beware. A silence fell between us. Lestrade's face darkened. Bloody hell. Holmes exhaled, folding the document once more. This was not a confession. It was a warning. I swallowed. Warning of what? Holmes turned, his silhouette cutting sharp against the mist. That, Watson, is the question that will not let us rest. Lestrade muttered a curse, rubbing his temple. So what now? If you tell me we have another villain to hunt before dawn, I swear I'll— No, Lestrade, Holmes said quietly. Now we wait. The wind stirred the mist around us, curling it into ghostly shapes. Somewhere in the depths of the city, Irene Adler had disappeared into the night, leaving behind only unanswered questions and the promise of a game not yet finished. I glanced at Holmes, expecting some sign of frustration, some flicker of disappointment at being outmaneuvered. But there was none. Instead, there was only the faintest gleam of anticipation in his eyes. Because the best mysteries, I realized, never truly ended.